Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 2 minutes. If you haven't signed in, please sign in the back so we can make sure we have you on future distribution lists. So thank you. Oh, tables out front for the signatures. I saw a draft last week. I figure you're always going to go. Okay, let's go ahead, and I'd like to welcome you all to our October packaging workshop. I'm Howard Levinson. I'm Deputy Director here at CalRecycle, and I'll be sort of emceeing for the day. Before I make any further remarks, I want to introduce our director, Scott Smithline, to make some opening remarks. Scott's been very, very involved in this issue for a long time, and we'd like him to make a few remarks. Scott's also got to deal with the fires that are going on in the northern part of the state. So I think while we have an important issue today, I think all of us recognize how devastating this has been to the state and that region. So he'll make some remarks today, but then he's got to go deal with some of the fire issues. So Scott, I'll just turn it over to you straight away.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for mentioning the fire, Howard. I feel compelled to make a very brief statement about it. I mean, on the way down in the elevator, I was texting with first responders on the front line, and there's not even words to describe what the challenges that people are facing right now. There's been loss of life. There's just total devastation of communities. It's not even an hour and a half away from where we're sitting right here today. So I just needed, maybe we just take a moment and, think about the people who are in harm's way right now. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the packaging workshop. We're here today to talk about packaging, obviously, packaging materials, packaging design, and how we manage packaging waste in the state of California. This is a critical element of the state's goal to get to 75% source reduction, recycling, and composting. Packaging constitutes approximately a quarter of what we're disposing in our landfills. Our recycling rate has dipped recently. We're at approximately 44% as we've seen an increase in disposal. We're seeing a corresponding increase in disposal of packaging over the last several years. As we develop a framework, a tool, a guide, a policy moving forward to how we want to manage packaging, I think it's really critical that we not only develop one that harnesses the lessons learned over the last several years that we've been working on this, but we really also need to look in the context of the current challenges that we're facing right now. And in particular, I'm referring to the international scrap market. Most of what's collected in our recycle bins is exported. The majority of that is exported. Of that which is exported, 62% of that goes to China. China has a new scrap import policy. I'm sure everybody knows about that, but that import policy addresses basically mixed paper and plastics. In other words, packaging. The policy is not yet finalized, but from what we understand, it's going to have a significant impact on the export markets. And I think we all have to take a moment to try and contemplate what that means when we're determining what recyclable means in the state of California. As I've done before, I also want to take a moment to commend the companies that have taken the time to make investments in their packaging, whether that be source reduction of materials, new packaging design, an increased recyclability of a package. These are efforts that many of you have come in and shared with us, and we appreciate those efforts. Again, I commend those efforts. We truly wish those efforts would be sufficient to have a meaningful impact on what's happening with packaging in the state of California, but thus far they have not. We've been fairly specific about the components of a packaging policy that we think are critical to move forward. Those include goals, specific goals. They include metrics for measuring those goals. Those include timelines for those goals, and those include dedicated financing and investment to achieve those goals. So what you're going to hear today is a mandatory approach, the development of a mandatory approach, not a specific policy, but a step towards moving towards a mandatory approach for packaging in the state, managing packaging in California. But hopefully, and what I understand and what I've seen is that we've done so and are suggesting a path that, while mandatory, allows for flexibility both on the part of the manufacturers as well as the department, and that will be a key guiding principle for us as we continue to move forward. Again, some of the key pieces that we're looking for in a little more general sense are that the policy that we're developing, hopefully collaboratively, will be comprehensive. It'll include front-end decision-making, again, packaging design and materials, as well as back-end processing and collection infrastructure. Those things need to be considered in a comprehensive kind of way. And again, all the stakeholders need to be involved in developing this packaging proposal for it to be successful. There are some new concepts in this paper. I encourage you to read the background paper. I know it's pretty substantial, but I think it's absolutely worth the time invested to read it carefully, to listen to the staff presentation today carefully. There's a lot to offer. And then ask your questions. We need to hear from you. Again, we need everybody involved in this process. So this is the time. Speak up, ask your questions, email us your questions, write us letters. We need to hear from you. I stood here, I think, almost 2 years ago at the end of, or no, it wasn't, yeah, it was towards the end of the Manufacturers Challenge. That was like 2 years ago. I think it was the last workshop we had on the voluntary approach. And, you know, we suggested at that time that a voluntary approach would be our preference, but that it had to be effective. And again, unfortunately, we found that not to have occurred, and that's why we're here. But that doesn't mean a mandatory approach is a black box where the state of California goes into a corner and comes up with a policy recommendation. So I guess what I really want to say is we continue to be committed to a collaborative approach to work with all the stakeholders to really develop a meaningful policy for packaging in California. That hasn't changed. That's our standing commitment. I think with that, I want to thank Howard and the packaging team, which is what you see here, plus more. They've been working on this extensively for years and developed lots of very credible and thoughtful ideas on how we can manage packaging in the state of California. And so that's it. I think I want to thank you for coming, and good luck.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate both your sentiments about the fire and all the folks who are affected on that, and I think we'll just have to carry that with us all day and into the future. Scott basically pretty much said everything I wanted to say in the way of introductory remarks. I will cover a couple of things, but we really want to get into the staff presentation today. This process did start about 4 years ago, and it involved a whole series of workshops about whether a voluntary approach could be put forth. And as Scott said, we didn't really hear an overall comprehensive approach that would satisfy that goal. So in September of 2016, the director asked staff to develop a mandatory comprehensive approach for managing packaging in California. We had a workshop earlier this year in March that looked at some aspects of that, and then today we have this workshop where we're really presenting our overall thinking about what such an approach might look like. So it's really important that we explain that to you in sufficient detail, that you read the background paper. Scott said, listen to the presentation today and ask questions. We really want your input on what we're presenting today. I think Scott reiterated quite well the potential impacts of China's national sword policy. We're looking at a declining export market probably, so this becomes even more important in terms of how we're going to deal with packaging in California, whether it's to source reduce more or to recycle more, what that means for manufacturing, collection and manufacturing infrastructure in the state, and a lot of other issues related to that. A lot of you have spoken very eloquently at the various workshops. You've told us in many instances that a one-size-fits-all policy really doesn't work for all packaging. And I think, as you'll see, and as Scott alluded to, we have at least are exploring a comprehensive framework approach that would include a range of different policy tools that could be applied to different situations and different packaging types. We're going to talk about that extensively. The team, I do want to acknowledge, while there are a lot of other folks, the team that's really been the core on this is Cynthia, Karen, and Teresa. They've done a great job of pulling together information and thinking about this, and I think it's reflected in the quality of the paper and the presentations that you're going to hear today. So thank you all for everything that you've done on this. The flow of the morning today is going to be Karen and the team are going to present for about 45 minutes on what's in the paper. We're going to walk through our approach to a comprehensive mandatory framework approach. We want you to hear all of this first before we break up and have some discussions, so you can see the broad picture of where all the pieces fit together and the overall direction. So there'll be kind of 4 parts to the presentation: the general approach, policy tools for managing packaging, screening criteria and identifying priority packaging, and then applying the policy tools to packaging. Then around 10 o'clock or so, we'll have about 2 hours for open discussion, and we're going to break that up into 2 parts. One will be an opportunity for all of you to get up on the soapbox and make general statements about what you think of what we've presented today. We'll see how many people want to speak, and we may have to limit time a little bit. And then the second hour, we'll put up some more focused questions that are related to the different pieces of the approach and try and solicit some input on that. And then we'll close around 12:15 or so. There won't be any breaks, so if most of you are familiar with this building, if you need to go to the restrooms, they're around the corner to the left, my left, your right, or your left as you walk out. Cafeteria is downstairs. Feel free to get up and stretch. If there is a fire drill, and we have been having a series of those, we will be walking out the back doors, down the stairs, and out across the street to Cesar Chavez Park. So follow us out, and we'll get you out there safely. I think that is it, other than if you are online, please send all your questions, comments, or if you have any issues technically, send them to the following email: packaging@calrecycle.ca.gov. And we'll monitor that throughout the day, and we'll, when we get to the open discussion, if people have got comments, we'll read them off and try to respond to them. Lastly, just a reminder to sign in when you go out. The table is outside the door so that we can keep you on our listservs. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to make the major presentation. Ready?
Thank you, Howard. And thank you to all of you for coming, either in person or via the broadcast. We really appreciate your continued participation and engagement on this issue, and we very much value the feedback that we've received from you over the course of this process, and look forward to continuing that dialogue today and in the following months. So I'd like to start by providing some context to build on comments both from Scott and Howard on what the department hopes to accomplish today and through the remainder of this process, and why the department is pursuing this particular approach for managing packaging. I'll then transition to a discussion of the proposed policy framework for managing packaging that's detailed in the background document, and then talk about next steps for the department. So one of the driving statutes for the department is AB 341, which was passed in 2011 and established a 75% statewide goal for source reduction, recycling, and composting. As we reported earlier this year, and as Scott mentioned in his opening remarks, the total amount of landfill disposal and disposal-related activities in California have grown considerably since 2010 to a total of 42.7 million tons in 2016. This corresponds to a recycling rate of 44%, which is the lowest recycling rate that we've seen since this statute was passed. And as a reminder, our goal is 75% by the year 2020. So if disposal continues to increase at the rates that we're currently using for our projections, we would need to divert an additional 24 million tons from disposal and disposal-related activities in 2020. So this trend of increasing disposal is creating additional pressure and motivation for the department to find solutions to manage this material, divert it from landfills, and find higher and better uses for our materials. So the packaging reform efforts are one of several key initiatives the department is pursuing related to the 75% goal. And this is because packaging is a significant amount of the disposed waste stream. Our last two waste characterization studies in 2008 and 2014 indicate that packaging represents approximately 1/4 of the disposed waste stream. This amounted to 8 million tons in 2014 and roughly 9 million tons in 2016. If we take a look at what packaging is comprised of in terms of its materials, over half of packaging that's disposed is fiber and paper-based, so roughly 5 million tons in 2016, and plastic accounts for about 1/4 of disposed packaging, or a little over 2 million tons. And together, fiber and plastics account for 90% of disposed packaging currently in our waste stream. So as CalRecycle continues to consider how to meet the 75% statewide recycling goal, one key factor that we're keeping in mind is that the management of post-consumer packaging does not exist just in California, that this is part of an international commodities market, and that we're seeing significant changes within that commodity market. So CalRecycle estimates that about 11 million tons of California-generated recyclable materials is exported annually to foreign markets, and a significant portion of this material is packaging. This accounts for approximately 1/6 of all material generated in California on an annual basis, shown in yellow on the pie chart on the slide. So these recent policy changes, including China's national sword policy to address illegal imports and China's proposed import ban on scrap commodities and increasing restrictions on contamination levels for other commodities, will likely have dramatic impacts on California's management of recyclable materials. So as the reliability of international markets diminish, it becomes increasingly important to support in-state and in-country processing and manufacturing for post-consumer recyclable materials. And we hope that any new policy approach would also enhance the resiliency of California's existing infrastructure to manage these materials. So in considering a packaging policy, staff have identified several broad goals that we were keeping in mind in our development. A packaging policy should divert a significant amount of material from landfill, as well as move it towards source reduction, recycling, and higher uses for that material. In addition, we know that improper end-of-life management for packaging has a number of other environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions, marine and waterway debris, and potential public health impacts. And it's our hope that a policy would also address these other environmental impacts as well. Finally, we want our packaging policies to help develop in-state and in-country infrastructure to manage this material. So as we move forward, the department is very aware that packaging is a complex product category with a variety of cross-media considerations and stakeholders that are involved within the product chain. This timeline illustrates the extensive stakeholder engagement process that CalRecycle has undertaken since late 2012 to better understand the functions of packaging in the marketplace, the barriers to packaging recovery, and the variety of stakeholder concerns and perspectives regarding its end-of-use management. So during this process, CalRecycle has consulted with quite a range of stakeholders, including recyclers, brand owners, manufacturers, haulers, landfill and processing facility operators, industry trade associations, local governments, NGOs, academic institutions, and environmental consulting groups, and I'm sure I'm missing a couple in there as well. In addition, this will be the 7th public forum that we've held on packaging since beginning this process. And these public forums have included significant discussion and background documents from staff, as well as feedback from stakeholders in the form of forums and public comments. So I won't discuss each milestone, but I want to touch again on the recent events that have led us to today's discussion. At CalRecycle's September 2016 public meeting, staff presented a summary of packaging efforts to date, as well as a summary of the manufacturer's challenge to pursue a voluntary approach for managing packaging. The summary essentially stated that the key components that we requested, that the voluntary activities be specific to California, that they have proposed activities, metrics, timelines, and financing, were not addressed in a significant way. And so in response, our director approved the staff recommendation to proceed with the development of a mandatory, comprehensive, statewide packaging policy model, along with a public consultation process to inform the development of that model. So as a part of that process, CalRecycle hosted a workshop in March of this year to generate discussion and gather stakeholder feedback to contribute to the development of a packaging policy model. This included a panel of experts and practitioners of policies identified at previous policy workshops, including landfill bans, EPR, and minimum recycled content requirements. CalRecycle sought feedback on the impacts of those and other policies and what impact they might have within California, given our unique infrastructure, other packaging-related laws, policies, and other environmental considerations.
Karen, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're getting a question about the volume. If you could maybe speak up or speak in the mic a little bit, or if we still get questions, I'll talk to AV about raising the volume.
Thanks, Sally. So today's workshop marks the next stage in CalRecycle's development process for this comprehensive packaging policy model. After almost 5 years of listening to stakeholders and meeting extensively, we're releasing our thinking on how to address this portion of the waste stream. So we want to continue to gather ideas and feedback from you on how this could be implemented and what other factors we should take into consideration. I want to emphasize a few points. First is that this model is still in development. We're preparing draft recommendations for early 2018 for formal consideration by our director, and we're looking for feedback on our approach to incorporate into those draft recommendations. To that end, we'll be taking feedback later in this workshop, as Howard mentioned, but we'll also be accepting written comments through the end of the month, and also encourage and that we would like to have individual meetings with you to further discuss these ideas. We've also mentioned this before, but I want to make clear that having a packaging policy model does not necessarily mean that CalRecycle is pursuing legislation, that it's still too early in the process for us to have any recommendations to that extent. Finally, we're here today to discuss a mandatory approach for managing packaging, not whether or not CalRecycle should consider a mandatory approach. So with that in mind, last fall, staff were directed to develop a comprehensive mandatory policy model to manage packaging in California. And there are two general questions that I want to address at the start of our discussion. First, what does a mandatory comprehensive policy mean? So although a mandatory policy is relatively straightforward, I want to dive into a little bit about what comprehensive means to the department. So a comprehensive policy does not just mean a statewide policy goal or a recommendation. It must also include the following items. It must be a strategy to manage all packaging in California, as opposed to a piecemeal approach where we address one packaging material at a time. It should include enforceable metrics and goals, and you'll hear this phrase repeated throughout the staff presentation in the background document. This is really key for us. A comprehensive policy should also manage significant amounts of material moving to landfills, and it should provide authority to identify priority products and implement appropriate tools. And this is really critical both for the department and we feel for stakeholders to provide sufficient flexibility in how the key metrics and goals are met. Given the amount of progress that needs to be made to meet the 75% goal, staff identify that we can achieve more with a comprehensive approach. So the other common question that we want to address at the beginning is what is included in packaging. So we are using this term very broadly at this stage. It includes all packaging material types that are placed into the California market, so sold, distributed, imported, and otherwise. It also includes all types of packaging in terms of primary packaging to house the product, secondary and tertiary packaging materials. So as staff were developing a statewide mandatory comprehensive model for packaging, there were several requirements and essential components that we were keeping in mind in the development process. These essential components take into account stakeholder feedback that we've received over the last 5 years, as well as department goals and lessons learned from other programs that we administer. The first two we mentioned on the previous slide, but again, we think that it's critical that this strategy be comprehensive and flexible. We also think it's important to have a consistent process. Flexibility is great, but we also appreciate predictability that comes with a consistent process. We also feel that it's important for this policy to be transparent and include robust public participation, which is something that that's been very important to us through the development and will continue to be important as we implement any kind of policy. It should include, again, specific and enforceable goals and metrics. We also want this policy to recognize prior innovations and efforts. We're not looking to penalize entities that have made significant strides toward improving the management of packaging, but we want to move this entire material category toward better use and divert it from landfills. And then finally, we want to address both pre- and post-consumer life of packaging. So we'll certainly spend some time talking about collection and processing infrastructure, but we also recognize that design of packaging is key in terms of downstream effects for that material. So taking all of this into account, staff have identified that a packaging framework model is an approach that provides comprehensive coverage, builds in sufficient flexibility, and also has enough heft to move the amount of material out of landfills that's necessary to achieve our goals. In addition, a packaging framework offers opportunities for significant stakeholder feedback and expertise through the use of public forums and workshops. So how does this work? So following any statutory authority as needed, staff have identified 4 key stages for implementing a statewide packaging framework. In addition, these stages ultimately loop back on each other to allow for ongoing improvement and feedback in managing this material stream. So the first stage is creating guiding regulations to create and establish a consistent process for the framework. This would be done through the formal regulation process administered by OAL and establishes the process for how the framework would be implemented. There are a number of things incorporated in this, but I want to focus on 2 key aspects. The first is to develop a process to identify policy tools. These are the strategies that CalRecycle could use to manage packaging and would include a suite of policy tools as well as a process for how additional tools could be added to the list. The second piece of this would be to establish a process to evaluate and prioritize different types of packaging to help determine which materials could be addressed first within the framework. This would include an analysis of the waste stream and other key factors related to packaging. When implemented, this stage could also create a process for CalRecycle to selectively exempt individual companies that have reached the same goals as those set by the state by reducing packaging waste through voluntary efforts. The second stage of a packaging framework would be to select the policy tools. So once guidelines and regulations are in place, CalRecycle would use the established public process to match a policy tool or tools with select packaging via discussions at public workshop and a formal decision by the director. This would also include setting clear metrics and enforceable goals for packaging management. The third stage is then to implement those tools, where CalRecycle and involved stakeholders would work together to implement the tool or tools for the identified packaging. This would also involve a discussion for timing of implementing the policy tools, including potentially phasing in tools in a particular sequence over time. And then finally, stage 4 would be to assess progress. This will allow the department to ask how the tools are working and how to best improve and respond to market changes or technical challenges. If there are changes, the framework would then loop back to stage 2 for that packaging type. And in order for this stage to be successful, there must be specific metrics and goals for measuring success. This should also take into account current efforts to reduce packaging waste. In addition, this stage could include opportunities for responsible parties to transition to voluntary systems if program metrics and goals were met. So staff believe that providing CalRecycle with statutory authority to systematically address packaging allows CalRecycle to develop an efficient approach that is complementary to existing requirements and provides both flexibility and consistency. In addition, a framework approach allows for phasing in how policies are implemented to manage packaging. This allows for the department to address low-hanging fruit earlier in the process and allow additional time to develop some of the more complicated tools before they're implemented. So the background document focused on stages 1 and 2 of the packaging framework, as will this presentation. However, the department is seeking feedback on all 4 stages within the framework, and feedback received during and following today's workshop will guide the development of draft recommendations on how to manage packaging in California, which we aim to release again in early 2018. So with that, I want to speak more specifically about the department's thinking on how these stages would be implemented within a framework approach, starting with identifying policy tools. So a discussion of various policy tools has been central to the packaging reform process over the last 5 years, and were a specific focus at the March workshop earlier this year. During this time, we've heard many suggestions for policy tools that could be used in California to manage packaging, as well as quite a bit of discussion on their relative merits. Staff identified 13 policy tools for managing packaging that were suggested during those discussions. And although not all of these tools would necessarily be applied within a framework, we wanted to list them all for completeness as a part of today's discussion. So they include source reduction, labeling requirements, recyclable or compostable design, a statewide standard list of recyclable and compostable packaging, minimum post-consumer recycled content, producer responsibility, which could take a number of different forms, a landfill ban, a deposit system, increasing the landfill tipping fee overall. This is not specific to packaging. A packaging product sales ban, pay-as-you-throw, advanced recycling fees, and material management fees. So staff then conducted a general qualitative evaluation of those identified tools that was informed again by past workshops. This evaluation also took into account a number of factors, including but not limited to extent of shared responsibility across the product chain, interaction with current collection systems and infrastructure, financing, development of markets, education and outreach, and program enforcement. And this is detailed in the background document, but again, is reflective of the feedback that we have received over the course of this process, as well as CalRecycle's internal discussions. Finally, although, again, we have listed the 13 tools that were identified during the stakeholder process, not all of these tools would necessarily be considered for application within the statewide framework, and would depend on later stages, as I'll discuss later. So our analysis of these tools indicate that there are trade-offs for every tool listed. There is significant variation in complexity, likely impact, utility as a standalone tool, and effectiveness, based on packaging type. So this led to the conclusion that there is no single tool that will manage all packaging and move a significant amount of material from landfills. And as a result, any packaging policy model will need to incorporate multiple tools in order to be successful. And so this highlights the importance of having a suite of options to consider for managing packaging as a part of a framework approach. The next stage in the regulation development phase on the framework is to identify priority packaging. So as a part of developing this piece of the framework policy, staff solicited preliminary stakeholder input on potential screening criteria to identify priority packaging. And this was in July and August of this year. And we received a significant amount of stakeholder feedback, and thank you very much for that. We've certainly appreciated it. It amounted to 26 comment letters from 36 different entities, and these have all been posted on the public notice page. The suggestions were quite varied and included 9 new criteria in addition to quite a bit of feedback on the 9 proposed criteria. And again, I want to say that this has been very helpful for guiding our thinking on priority packaging, both in terms of developing our final priority screening criteria, but also for how we pair tools with packaging. So in reviewing and incorporating the comments received, there were a few filters that we kept in mind. First, we were interested in using a database screening to the greatest extent possible. So we limited our criteria to factors with well-defined data sets that provided sufficient granularity to distinguish between different types of packaging. This resulted in us condensing the original 9 criteria into a final 6 categories, as you'll see today. I want to specifically mention the elimination of reusability and recyclability as a screening criterion. This was a criterion that was widely supported by stakeholders and one that we also support as being very critical for the management of packaging. However, we weren't able to identify any clear data sources to use for this as a screening criteria that provided sufficient granularity and was able to clearly define reusability and recyclability. And I think part of this is just the challenge of those terms, in that what is recyclable is highly dependent on technology and markets, and finding a single data source or factor to quantify that is very, very challenging. And so as a result, we chose to not include it as a screening criterion for determining priority packaging. However, we applied this factor in considering which mandatory policy tools would be best suited for different types of packaging. So we've still incorporated this thinking, just not in the screening criteria. Second, staff focused on screening criteria that were waste-related or that were directly related environmental criteria, so greenhouse gas impacts and waterway and marine debris. I want to note that we received a significant amount of conflicting feedback on the waterway and marine debris criterion, and I want to address that just briefly. We ultimately decided to include it for 3 reasons. First, decreasing the amount of waterway and marine debris is consistent with CalRecycle's mission to protect public health and the environment. Second, this criterion addresses cross-agency interests of reducing pollution, as the majority of trash in waterways is packaging and as a result of improper management of the material. And finally, the material properties of individual packaging directly relate to their long-term environmental impacts. And so for those reasons, we decided to keep this criterion. So following the incorporation of stakeholder feedback, staff developed the following 6 screening criteria. First, prevalence in the disposed waste stream, usage trends, current collection infrastructure, current processing infrastructure, which combines the previous processing infrastructure and contamination criteria, greenhouse gas impacts of recycling, and waterway and marine debris. So each screening criterion was then applied to a list of 13 packaging categories. We limited our packaging categories to fiber and plastic because these materials comprise 90% of the packaging waste stream. However, this would not preclude other packaging materials from being incorporated into a final model. So this process is fully detailed in the background document, but I want to provide an example of how the screening criteria would be applied to 3 plastic types: film plastic, PET containers, and HDPE containers. So for each criterion, packaging types were assigned a number corresponding to high, medium, or low priority, 1, 0, and -1, respectively, based on whether they were of greater concern or focus for that criterion. So for the first criterion, highest priority was assigned to materials with the highest prevalence in the disposed waste stream. And so as a result, film plastic was considered high priority, whereas HDPE containers were considered low priority. For usage trends, we were concerned our highest priority was given to materials that were continuing to see increasing usage, and so all 3 plastic types received high priority for this criterion. For current collection infrastructure, high priority was given to materials that are not commonly accepted at curbside collection. And so again, film plastic was a high priority material, whereas PET and HDPE containers, which are widely accepted at curbside, were low priority for this criterion. For processing infrastructure, highest priority was given to materials not accepted at MRFs, and that were also not rigorously sorted, in that they were frequent contaminants of other material types. And so as a result, film plastic was again a high priority, and PET and HDPE containers were a low priority. The greenhouse gas emissions criterion prioritized high GHG savings due to recycling, and so all of the plastics were assigned either middle or low priority. And then finally, for waterway and marine debris, priority was given to materials that were widely found during coastal cleanup. And then as a last step, the priority for each criterion was summed by packaging type to give the final prioritization shown in the bottom line. So 5 for film plastic, -1 for PET containers, and -4 for HDPE containers. Now I want to emphasize that the absolute number is not as important as the relative ranking of these materials. And again, this is a strategy for us to identify which material types we could address first within a framework, not which ones should or should not be considered within a framework approach. So the result of this analysis were the identification of 6 priority packaging types, 3 for fiber and 3 for plastic. And those are uncoated corrugated cardboard, waxed cardboard, aseptic containers and cartons, film plastic, expanded polystyrene, and pouches. So the next stage of the framework, now that we have identified a suite of tools and selected priority packaging, is to match them together. In applying policy tools under a packaging framework, we took 2 approaches. First, we considered policy tools that could be applied generally to all packaging, and then we also looked at policy tools that could be focused on specific packaging in order to address specific challenges for managing that packaging. So under the first approach of considering policy tools for all packaging, we identified 8 tools that could apply. And these are source reduction, producer responsibility, pay-as-you-throw, landfill tipping fee, advanced recycling fee, a statewide list of recyclable and compostable materials, recyclable or compostable design, and labeling requirements. And I want to note that 2 of these tools, pay-as-you-throw and increasing landfill tipping fee, if implemented, would be applied generally to all materials, not just packaging. So this kind of broad approach has a number of advantages. It takes advantage of economies of scale in that the cost to manage is going to be lower if we have more materials that we're covering. It also allows for consistent education in material management, material-wide and potentially statewide, depending on the tool. It can also provide a broader funding base to support efforts for packaging overall, and provides benefits to a range of products in that by applying tools to all packaging, we may wind up addressing lower priority packaging earlier than we would if we went packaging by packaging. In addition, it may be necessary to apply more than one tool in this context in order to meet the goals in a meaningful way. However, one drawback to only applying broad tools to all packaging is it does not necessarily address management needs for individual packaging types. And so as a result, we also pursued a complementary approach of identifying policy tools for specific packaging, which allows for challenges of that packaging type to be addressed. And I want to provide a couple of examples of what we mean by packaging-specific challenges that could be addressed by pairing individual tools with packaging types. So uncoated corrugated cardboard and waxed cardboard were both identified as priority products, but the primary management challenge is different for each. Uncoated corrugated cardboard is highly recyclable. However, it continues to be a significant portion of the disposed waste stream. In contrast, waxed cardboard is not recyclable, and so how we would think about managing those materials is very different. For cartons, there is significant interest in making this material recyclable, but markets have been slow to develop. So we would think about pairing tools that would help with marketability and downstream management of those materials. And then finally, a key technical and economic challenge for multi-layer pouches is separating the materials in that pouch for recycling. And so again, the strategies are going to be different for that material. So to further illuminate our thinking, I want to walk through one priority product, film plastic, to discuss the challenges that we identified and how we selected policy tools to address those challenges. So we identified four key challenges for managing film plastic. First, it is a very lightweight material, which makes it expensive to collect and transport and and to accumulate enough material to make it economically viable. In addition, film plastics are often used with food, which can lead to downstream contamination and challenges for its recycling and management. We also know that curbside collection of this material leads to significant contamination of other materials, as well as damage to MRF machinery. And then finally, film plastic, although we're using it as one category, has quite a range of plastic types and material properties within this category. So it's not a homogeneous stream to manage. So in selecting policy tools to address the challenges from managing film plastic, we kept in mind that when collected in bulk and when it is clean and separated, that there are viable end markets for this material. And so we're thinking about how can we move more of this material stream toward viable end markets. And so our goals were to ensure cleaner streams and address the challenges of collection and management for film plastic. First, we felt that it was critical to establish stable funding and possibly management for this material stream in order to address the costs of managing film plastic. And this could take a variety of forms, of which a few are suggested on the screen. Next, we wanted to minimize generation of this material, both to prevent pollution as well as to decrease the amount of material managed, and this could be accomplished via source reduction. Third, we wanted to find ways to ensure clean streams of material through source separation or other requirements on a standard practice for recycling of this material. And finally, if the above measures were not sufficient to reduce disposal, improve material design, and find better uses for post-consumer film plastic, we wanted to use a stronger tool to discourage use, and this could take the form of a labeling requirement to indicate that the materials are not recyclable in California. So we performed the same type of analysis for all of the priority packaging as detailed in the background document, and I want to show some of the range of policy tools that were identified here. This is not comprehensive, but is a selection. I also want to reiterate that this is not a final list and is intended to continue the discussion on how to manage packaging under a mandatory comprehensive model. And as a part of the process guided by the packaging framework, there would be significant opportunity for stakeholder input and expertise on which tools should be selected and how they would be implemented. And again, this would be done through public forums, either workshops or at CalRecycle's monthly public meeting. So a final part of the packaging framework is to implement policy tools and assess progress. Staff are still developing recommendations for this piece, but we want to emphasize again that specific metrics and enforceable goals will be critical for success. And again, are looking for suggestions and feedback from stakeholders on these two pieces as staff work toward draft recommendations. So this concludes the staff presentation on mandatory comprehensive framework to manage packaging. Again, staff anticipate releasing a set of draft recommendations in early 2018 for consideration by the director that will identify the best strategies for handling packaging in California. This will include refinements of stages 1 and 2 based on feedback provided at and after today's workshop, and will include a complete discussion of stages 3 and 4 of a framework approach. So we recognize that this is a lot of material to cover and discuss, and we're looking forward to hearing your feedback. As Howard mentioned earlier, we're going to break this into a period of general discussions and then specific feedback on the stages within a packaging approach. And so with that, thank you for giving us a chance to walk through our entire thinking on this, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I'm sure that's a lot of material for folks to be thinking about. Again, we urge you to read the background paper, but as far as I know, to me, this is a really thoughtful approach on how we might implement a comprehensive mandatory framework for packaging in California. I'm not aware of this kind of a breadth of discussion happening elsewhere. So I think this is the first time this is out for public discussion. We're really interested in your feedback on this. We're going to have about an hour or so for general discussion. I think Karen mentioned this earlier. Remember that our directors asked us to develop this comprehensive mandatory approach. So we're not here to debate whether a mandatory approach is needed or not. We understand people have various opinions on that. But what we're really interested in is this process that we've laid out, this idea that if we got statutory authority, we would undertake rulemakings to establish a process for selecting tools, a process for selecting or prioritizing packaging, and then the ability to establish requirements for whatever those decisions were. Does that make sense? And if you think it does, how could it be improved? If you don't think it makes sense, what's wrong with it? Where are there missing parts? That's the kind of feedback that we're interested in today. I hope you all recognize that we really took it to heart that there is not one size that fits all. We spent a lot of time thinking about this over the last several years, but especially the last 6 months. And we looked at it. Is there one tool that would work for everything? And it just didn't seem like there is one such tool. So that's the impetus for this idea of selecting a process, having a process for selecting tools. Some tools might work for multiple types of packaging, others might be specific. But that's the reasoning or the thought process behind what you're hearing today. So let me, we're going to have an hour of general discussion. We'll come back and talk about the specific stages that Karen has presented. I'm sure this is going to overlap. Let me just get a general sense, if you give me hands in the air, of who wants to make more general statements in this opening section, just so I kind of know what timing we're looking at. Get them up higher so I can see. Or if you're wavering, okay, not that many. Well, then I won't put a time limit on, but I will ask you to be cognizant that we want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak today, that as you speak, others may think of things they want to say. So we have a roving mic. Oh, there you are, Fareed. I'll try to keep tabs on who's got their hands up. I saw a few over here, so if you can, we'll just work our way up this side and then we'll come back around. And go ahead, Fareed. If you can kindly identify yourself and your affiliation, and then make a statement that, you've got a few minutes, but don't go 5 or 10 minutes, but 2 or 3 minutes would be appreciated.
I will be brief. Gene Urban, representing Waste Management. The chart on page 7, do I interpret it correctly? It would suggest that disposal increased modestly, but that the disposal of packaging decreased substantially, which is the objective, correct? So we can all go home early? Am I wrong? Page 7?
Page 7 of the background paper.
No, so the
Okay.
charts are comparing 2008 to 2014, and
Okay.
the amount of packaging that's disposed is really dependent on the total amount of disposal within the state. Since as a part of our waste characterization study, we characterize packaging as a fraction of the disposed waste stream. So
Declined by 15% while all disposal went up modestly. That's the way I read it, 9.5 to 8,000 or 8 million.
well, so between 2008 and 2014, the total amount of disposal did go down. However, and that's between 2008 and 2014. But if we look at the recent trends for disposal, we're seeing it continue to increase. So relative between our two waste characterization studies, yes, it did go down, but we are seeing packaging continue. We're seeing disposal overall and packaging as a portion of disposal are continuing to increase.
Based on studies that you have not yet revealed, or I'm just looking at the data you presented.
Correct. So So again, between 2008 and 2014, we're seeing a couple of moving pieces. One is overall changes in disposal, as well as our measurement of packaging. Packaging has been relatively consistent, a quarter of the disposed waste stream in every waste characterization study that we've performed over the last 20 or so years at CalRecycle. On page 6, which shows disposal over time, yes, between 2008 and 2014, it did go down, but our recent trends are that it's continuing to go up. So I apologize that this slide is maybe a little bit immediately misleading, but our primary driver currently is that disposal is going up. It's gone up 6 million tons in the last 4 years, and we've seen no significant declines in disposal since 2009.
I'll suggest relates directly to the decline in exports.
Gene, can you speak more directly into the microphone?
Which relates directly to the decline in exports, or the refusal of China and others to continue to import. But I just wanted to see clarity on page 7. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Chuck White with Manette Phelps and Phillips LLP. I've got a couple questions and comments. Just to follow up on Gene, I mean, the chart on page 7 does show a reduction between 2008 and 2014 in packaging disposal. It goes from 9.5 million tons down to 8 million tons. So at least with respect to the data you're showing today on packaging, it seems to be going in the direction you'd like it to go. Now, there may be other data we haven't seen, but it does seem to indicate a downward trend in packaging disposal. A broader question is, and all due respect to AB 341 and the importance of complying with state law, I think one of the biggest missing pieces is a very clear and articulate description of the problem you're trying to solve with respect to packaging. I mean an environmental problem, I mean a public health problem, I mean some other problem that needs to be more clearly articulated than seems to be the case so far. What is the damage that packaging is causing? Okay, maybe packaging is present in stormwater runoffs. Clearly the water board is working at it. Other agencies are concerned about marine debris. But, for example, considering a landfill fee on film plastics is not going to help the marine debris problem. In fact, you would probably want to decrease the fees on landfills to try to get more packaging waste collected and processed more cheaply so it doesn't result in marine debris. I think one of the last workshops in March, someone actually said, yeah, in order to address the marine debris problem, we need to ban film plastics from landfills, which to me was an absurd statement. It's exactly the opposite. So I guess I would be asking you to try to be more clear on what is the real world problem. All due respect, again, to a 75% goal, what is, in fact, the problem you're trying to address in terms of human health, public safety, or the environment? Number two, one of the biggest missing pieces in my mind is the lack of addressing the development of syngas technology that could be used to handle these top priority materials that you're looking at, and that's fibers and plastics. There is developing technologies worldwide to use syngas, pyrolysis, gasification, to be able to generate a low carbon fuel. Most of the data that I've seen indicates a near zero carbon intensity, which is another aspect of California's myriad of environmental programs that is in need of more robust opportunities and development. So I would strongly suggest that as part of this overall package, you take a look at some of the barriers to siting and using syngas type of technologies to convert these kinds of residual solid wastes that need to be collected, that need to be processed to get out of the marine debris, for example, and produce a low carbon fuel that California desperately needs to meet its greenhouse gas goals. And then finally, I'm hoping that you do a comprehensive life cycle assessment on all of these types of things. Because packaging is not just packaging that produces a waste material that has to be managed. It actually preserves many of the products and keeps them out of the waste stream, thereby preventing greenhouse gas. I'm thinking of right now the most prevalent example is food waste. Without film plastic packaging, we'd have much more food waste, I think, but I would like to have that be certainly clear and made part of this whole evaluation as to whether or not you're going to be able to really reduce greenhouse gases. The chart you have, I can't remember what page it is, shows that the greenhouse gas impacts of film packaging is minor or near neutral, if anything. Okay, so what is the problem? What are, again, the problem we're trying to solve? Is it getting stuff out of marine debris? That means it needs to be collected, it needs to be processed, and conceivably used to produce a low carbon fuel. Anyways, that's my primary comments. I'd be happy to follow that up in writing.
Thank you, Chuck. Let me take a first shot at answering a couple of those, or at least responding to a couple of those, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues here on the panel. With respect to what's the goal, I personally have to disagree with you. We are driven by the statutes that have been enacted by the legislature. AB 341 and the 75% goal is the primary statute, other than along with the bottle bill, that we really are operating under at CalRecycle. We have a goal of achieving 75% reduction of solid waste via reduction, composting, and recycling by 2020. That's a very daunting goal. We all know how difficult it's going to be. A lot of the issues that you've raised have been discussed in public before, but that's our primary driver. We have looked at that in the context of environmental impacts. For example, some of the screening criteria that we talked about address marine debris, GHGs, and things like that. So I think that we are looking at these broader potential environmental impacts, but under that framework of our primary statutory drivers. You might not agree with that, but that's just kind of how we're approaching this. With respect to syngas and conversion technologies or pyrolysis gasification, that's been a long-standing debate in California, as you well know. There's been many attempts in the legislature to try and change definitions and open up some of those technologies. So your point's well taken. We understand that concern. Lastly, with respect to life cycle analysis, to me that's something that's very easy to say, and I don't mean this negatively. It's easy to say apply life cycle analysis. Those of you who've conducted life cycle analyses within any one product type know how difficult it is to even do comparisons within the different variations of a product, let alone to try and cross product boundaries and do a broad scale life cycle analysis. We did that for organics. It was very, very difficult and didn't come to any great significant conclusions. We did it for used oil, spent $2.5 million in 3 years, and again, did not have enough information to make really significant conclusions about the environmental impacts of different management technologies. So life cycle is important, but I think that ultimately it's a paralysis. If you were thinking we can do, you're going to have to wait for a full life cycle analysis before we can move forward on that. So that's my personal opinion. I know folks will not agree with that necessarily, but often these decisions have to be made on a more somewhat quantitative, but a more qualitative approach. And that's what we've outlined here, is a process that would be embodied in rulemaking that would allow for discussion of those relative trade-offs before some particular product type is looked at or before some particular tools are brought to bear on that. And then your points about those specific policy tools, whether they work or not for that particular product, that's exactly the kind of thing that we would have to discuss in a public rulemaking if we went through this approach. So those are just some initial responses. I don't know if any of you want to say more. Leave it to Howard to take the brunt. It's okay. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. Howard, you took the words out of my mouth quite a bit, actually. You have fairly clear statutory direction in AB 341, in SB 1383. They both have 75% goals, with AB 341 having the broad 75% goal. I'll tell you, as the sponsor of the bill, this is exactly the type of process we envisioned. We were hoping we'd see it earlier than 2017. The bill was passed in 2011. It's a 2020 goal. We're glad you're finally getting to it. And also with SB 1383, which was passed last year, which has a 75% organics diversion mandate. And organics obviously includes fiber and paper as well. This is a very broad document, and so I'll keep my comments fairly high level. I think you've done a great job of identifying some of the problem products that need to be addressed, as well as taking a comprehensive approach at evaluating these products. You know, things that jump out where you have clear existing authority, things including aseptics and cartons and some of the fiber materials, as well as some of your existing authority under RPPC, as well as other materials that we know could easily be recycled with greater investment. Again, thinking about aseptics, thinking about thermoforms. And we also appreciate the concept of really putting the onus on producers to achieve the recycling that we know we can achieve. And my final comment is, if you look at the products you've identified, you actually see by omission how to solve this problem. The products that are identified are the ones that are not part of existing programs, like the California Bottle Bill. And that is a successful model that we should implement for some of these non-beverage rigid plastics, again, aseptics, et cetera, but also with products like expanded polystyrene, where we know that the inherent nature of that material, especially when it's food coated, makes it not recyclable and material that ends up in the waterways of the state. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. Greg Haskin, PepsiCo. Couple of just quick requests for clarification and comments. The first is around film. It would be nice to have a more clear definition of what you define as film. You know, there's a whole variety of things that could fall under the category of film, including some packaging that my company makes, for example, potato chip bags or cereal liners within cereal boxes. Is that film or not? That would be very important to know those sorts of things. Another comment about film is that did you factor in the fact that a lot of the film that is manufactured in the state of California is manufactured from recycled plastic, and what would this program do to impact that? And then after that, what would that do to impact scrap values if suddenly the film industry that relies on recycled plastic doesn't have the stream of recycled plastic that it needs? And then another category that begs some clarification is you talk about waxed cardboard containers and aseptics. There's always been this absolute line in the sand, bold, dark line you cannot cross, which is dairy. You can't put any kind of a cost to recycle on dairy. You can't have it in the bottle bill. You can't have any kind of a deposit or anything else. Now suddenly, most of the products that fit in that category, or many of the products that fit in the category of aseptics and waxed cardboard, are dairy. So are you demonstrating that you're going to have a shift in policy in that regard? So there's two areas of clarification that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Right, so thank you for the questions. We are using a fairly broad definition of film plastic. There's one provided on page 25 of the background document, but I'll just read it so that we can all be on the same page. That film plastic is a package or container made of flexible or easily yielding materials that, when filled or closed, can be readily changed in shape. Examples include shrink wrap, furniture wrap, sandwich bags, food wrappers, and plastic food wrap. So it's fairly broad at this stage. To your second question about whether or not we are indicating a shift in policy to start including dairy within our programs, we are not making a decision one way or another at this stage. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're considering packaging very broadly right now, independent of the materials that are being packaged or are contained in that packaging. So that would be, I think, part of further discussions moving forward with this approach.
I had a question, Allie.
Do you think National Sword may create a new priority on some of the 3 to 7 plastics currently exported? What would that look like? And that's from Nina with Green Blue.
So as we mentioned earlier, that the National Sword policies are certainly something that we're very concerned about and that we are actively monitoring what impacts they may have. And I think that's about all that we can say right now, but we're actively watching it.
Yeah, I mentioned in my opening remarks that the decline in the export markets, if it's significant enough, that may stimulate other thinking about funding and siting of manufacturing infrastructure in California or elsewhere around the country. CalRecycle is planning to have some public discussion about National Sword. We don't have any specific dates yet, but that is in the works, so stay tuned for that. Reed, I don't know where you are.
This is Heidi Sanborn with the
Oh, Heidi,
California
sorry.
Product Stewardship Council. As you know, we support the concept of producer responsibility and product stewardship, and that can mean mandatory or voluntary, and we believe that both can work. We do thank CalRecycle staff for an outstanding effort, by the way, on all the work that you've done. This is probably the most challenging product category because it isn't one product, it's not one material. So we do appreciate all the hard work. But after years of waiting for voluntary to work, and voluntary is voluntary, we haven't really seen it, the time has come, we think, for the framework approach. As you saw, is one of our colleagues, and they've asked me to read a statement for them. We agree a one-size-fits-all policy approach is not realistic given the many different kinds of materials waste haulers and recyclers must deal with in California. Therefore, a framework approach makes sense, giving CalRecycle the ability to identify and manage the appropriate policy tools needed to adopt and implement measurable enforceable goals for source reduction, reuse, and recycling. The framework approach will result in a more unified, comprehensive approach to packaging sustainability than if pursued in a piecemeal approach with many separate pieces of legislation. CalRecycle has the expertise and knowledge on the state's entire waste stream to manage the process of implementing and enforcing a comprehensive recycling plan for packaging. If the legislature fails to delegate this authority, it can expect to see many bills on packaging materials with no coherency and will consume enormous amounts of time in the legislature. So bold actions are needed to reach the state's 75% recycling goal, and they're needed soon. We would support those comments, but we also believe that there should be an off-ramp so that the companies who lead and do a great job of source reduction and recycling and redesign and infrastructure development should have some sort of regulatory off-ramp. We need to give incentives to the companies who lead, and we're very strong believers in that, so we'd like to talk about that more in depth. But we do strongly support your approach given the complexity of this category, and we look forward to working with any company and any group who wants to find solutions, do pilot projects, et cetera. And we look forward to hopefully finding a way forward together because we do have a problem. We need to solve it. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. I do want to ask, before we go to the next comment, Cynthia or Karen to point out where in the paper we have a discussion of off-ramp, because I think that is we didn't mention that in the presentation, and I think that's an important piece.
That is in the paper. I can't cite it's on the left-hand side. But I just wanted to, page 10. I just wanted to say that's something that was really important, and that's something that throughout the years that we've been meeting with companies, at least on an individual one-to-one basis, having those discussions has been something that's been consistent, is the very real need to address what's already been done in, if it were to come to a regulatory approach, because so much has been done on an individual basis, just to try to collectively bring others up to that. So I just wanted to reiterate, just as, I've been doing this since 2012, and that's something that I just want to personally say that it doesn't fall on deaf ears, so.
Thank you. Emily Topaldo, American Chemistry Council's Plastics Division. I have another clarification question. So with the areas where this initiative overlaps with other existing laws, I'm interested to hear how you all plan to coordinate with those offices that have oversight. I think one example, thinking back to the slide that was up using the film packaging priorities listed out, I know some of those elements are directly impacted by the single plastic bag carryout ban. And there could be efficiencies gained in some of those areas and some of the barriers overcome, by working with those who have oversight of that. So just interested to hear how you all plan to work with some of the other offices.
So we've had, thank you, Emily, nice to see you. We have been working pretty comprehensively, keeping our sister agencies and other agencies who are involved in some of these, I don't want to call it overlap programs, but that do touch on packaging. Packaging is such a broad, and as we're defining it currently, so broadly that it does touch a lot of different existing programs and agencies, and we outlined several of those in the paper. So we have been communicating regularly with those sister agencies and other departments, and we'll continue to do so as we move forward.
I'd also just add to that, and Cynthia spoke about our sister agencies like Toxic Substances Control and the Water Board and others. We would have our internal, one of the programs that you mentioned, Emily, is obviously internal to CalRecycle. So we have our PPC, we have single-use grocery bags, we have the bottle bill, things like that. We've had discussions internally with the folks who run those programs, and clearly those would be considerations that have to be brought to bear in any particular rulemaking or decision. So I appreciate that. Let's keep going. You've got the mic, but Jen, we'll come back up that side and then we'll circle back around. Thanks for
Hi, Martin Bork. I'm the executive director at the Ecology Center in Berkeley, one of the country's longest running curbside collection programs. I just wanted to note that some of the most problematic materials for us at our MRF would seem to fall very low on your prioritization scale. And it has to do with the volume of non-bottle rigid plastic containers. We've had to add additional trucks, we've had to add additional sorting capacity, and while we're now sorting into 4 different kinds of plastic, we used to have 2, and before that we had 4 different kinds of fibers, and now we have 2. And I'm sure you're well aware of the economics of that. So this affects both the criteria that you're using in terms of tonnage versus units or individual counts. And I think that's really, really critical that you get to a volume or an individual unit count in terms of the prevalence of these items. And also in terms of what kind of solutions you try and find. The solutions that are most problematic, the issues that are most problematic are market instability. We didn't want to collect those materials to begin with because of their problems internationally, and that's only gotten worse since we started collecting those mixed rigids. So ways that California can invest in infrastructure for pre-processing here or processing here. That can also hopefully drive some kind of feedback loop to the manufacturers and what kind of packaging they put out in the world. But also creating market stability in terms of, when stuff we collect has value, it stays out of the landfill much better than when it doesn't. I'll tell you right now, our city council is debating whether or not to raise rates or to stop collecting this material and send it to landfill. Right now it's costing us much more to export it, and I won't say it's getting recycled, I'll just say it's costing more to export it than it would be to send it to landfill. That's a real upside down equation. So market subsidy, market stability, the way that the bottle bill has provided for so many other materials that are hard to recycle or expensive to recycle. And I think that could be paid for both by increasing landfill cost, as you've identified there, but also in the producer pays model. As a landfill increase, it certainly improves the equation of sending those materials to landfill versus paying to recycle them, but that puts a double burden on the municipality or on the individual ratepayer. And I think the producer could certainly share that cost. The final thing I wanted to mention was, I didn't see anything in your criteria around health. And we know that many of these plastics are getting into key areas that affect ecological and human health. Certainly we know that they are accumulating chemicals in the oceans and waterways, and that's bioaccumulating up the marine food chain. But we are also now seeing it in our compost, and it's being applied to land applications in agriculture. And there is documented evidence that that's moving into the food system through agriculture. And then also, we're finding increasing evidence that it's in our air quality, and in our drinking water. And I think that you should consider one of your criteria being toxicology and health impacts, and using Prop 65 as one of your data tools in thinking about what are the priority materials. Thanks.
Appreciate the comment. We have just, and we will take that under consideration for sure. We have had discussions with both OEHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, as well as Department of Toxic Substances Control. OEHA is responsible for Prop 65. DTSC is responsible for toxics and packaging. So I think those are good points. We need to do some more exploration on that.
And I'll just add one other point in terms of your discussion about tonnage versus usage or volume and counts. And that's something that we've certainly has been raised before, and one that we are certainly taking into mind as we're thinking about strategies for how we manage this material. And one of the big challenges for us is that we measure by ton. And so how to convert to a usage or volume metric is something that's been really challenging for us to figure out how that would work, but we certainly would welcome feedback or suggestions on how to do that.
Miriam.
Okay, my name is Miriam Gordon. I am the policy director with Upstream Policy. And I just, first of all, I want to commend the department. I think that this is the right approach, a comprehensive policy framework for packaging. I agree with Nick. It's high time that we embark on this process, and that it does need to be a mandatory process, since the voluntary approach hasn't yielded good results. So I just want to say that I appreciate the concept of producer responsibility that's folded into this proposed framework. I think that but I think that there needs to be, as far as the criteria for selecting different policies, needs to focus on other stakeholders or constituencies that can help drive market change. And that's consumers primarily, and also distinctions between manufacturers and retailers. So I'd like to see in the final policy framework more of an articulation of how the different policies that are selected drive change through the different constituencies that can help drive market change. For example, I just came back from Europe, and I was living there in a home for 2 weeks, and the pay-as-you-throw model was really impacted me, because every time I unwrapped packaging from the grocery store or from shopping, I was extremely, this was in Switzerland, I was extremely cognizant of the fact that it was going to cost the household money to put a bag of non-recyclable packaging out front or to dispose of it. So it just drove home for me how important it is to signal. I felt as a consumer that that was a great signal. So more of an explanation of how each of these policies drives change and sends signals through to the various players that have an impact on the market. Another thing I would like to see more of in terms of a criteria that I think needs to be added for the policy selection is your department's own statutory mandate in terms of the integrated waste management hierarchy. I haven't seen that hierarchy, and I haven't had a chance to read in depth the document, so I may be off base here, but quick scan, I didn't see that the integrated waste management hierarchy and the focus on source reduction as the highest priority is a factor in the prioritization of policies. And as an example, you've eliminated reusables as one of the criteria or one of the impacts or criteria. So I'd like to have more of a discussion about how we can weave reusables back in, and just, I know that you have a lot of focus on source reduction in the framework, but the waste management hierarchy drives you to select that as a highest criteria. So I think that that needs to be a focus in policy selection, that it's the highest criteria. And last, I want to, two things I want to support that have been said is that we do need, for at least for accomplishing source reduction, we do need to focus on a different system of measurement than weight. And so, and the stakeholders that I have been talking to on this issue are pretty much aligned around the idea that it needs to be units in order to accomplish source reduction, and we'd be happy to expand on that more in our comments. And finally, I just want to put in support for Martin's comment about health as a criteria. There's so much emerging research in this area on packaging and human health, and plastics and microplastics on human health, that it's something that I feel the state really can't ignore. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Okay. I will just make one comment on the unit, the metric. I think that's something that we have talked about. We understand the issues with weight versus volume or units, and I think part of the issue for purposes of this paper is getting readily available data, something that we can use to kind of make some comparisons. But clearly, if there was something that was legislated, and that would be one of the issues we would have to grapple with, or the legislature would have to grapple with, is how would this be measured, and what kind of data would we then need in order to implement something along those lines.
Hi, this is Kevin Messner. I'm with the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. Actually, interestingly, listening to the previous speaker, which I wasn't sure I necessarily agree with a lot of what they said, but I actually did in some aspects. Pay as you throw, we have been saying for a number of years, and I have yet to hear many, if anybody, disagree that that is a good policy option, and I know that it's listed in your list, so that's good. Also, the clarity, which we always struggle with when we talk to the manufacturing or packaging engineers, what is the goal? And is it to reduce the weight? Is it to reduce the volume? Is it what if there is a desire to force and mandate something on a manufacturer to make a packaging like this? It would be nice to know what this is, because whatever is done, there's always a reason not to make it bigger. No, we don't want it bigger, we want it smaller. Okay, we don't want it smaller, we want it highly recyclable. I think, again, the previous speaker talking about the hierarchy, that gets lost in all these discussions. It's just a discussion on recycling. It's not a discussion on the actual hierarchy and trying to do something that makes sense based on the environmental hierarchy that's out there. And that gets to this larger framework. Frameworks have historically failed and always have failed because they are one size fits all. No matter how you develop these criteria, each product or packaging is different. The marine debris is different than a major appliance, which is different than institution IC&I packaging, which is different than consumer product packaging. And so if you try to lump them all together, I think we're just going to get bogged down in the complexities of the packaging debate, which has happened every time this happens when somebody tries to do something. And then when they force something through just because we want to have a mandatory program of some sort, and we'll call it a framework or we'll call it whatever it is, it doesn't work. British Columbia is a prime example. They forced it through. Just some recent stats, this is their own numbers. Their recovery rate is down, their recycling rate is down, their landfill diversion rate is down by almost 10%. Their recovery per capita is down. These are all decreasing values on trends that you are trying to increase. So part of your criteria should be, if we're going to do something, is it going to actually improve the recycling rate? And then before that, is the recycling rate the number one hierarchy that you're trying to achieve? And to the very first speaker, what are you trying to achieve? Less landfill, less what? There's so many unknowns, and it's still a struggle. I'm a little confused on why this step is here to try to create this broad one-size-fits-all framework criteria when each product is different. So those are our comments, and thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I will be happy to have further discussions, but I will disagree with you that this is a one-size-fits-all framework. I mean, it is a framework. I get that, but it is specifically designed, even at this conceptual level, to say that not one size fits all. So we'll be happy to have follow-ups on that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Tony Kingsbury. I have my own consulting firm, TK. I just had a question on slide 22. You list the 6 priority packages, and I was just curious what % of the overall waste stream, that we're trying to affect here are represented by those 6. And just trying to get at, I guess the secondary, in other words, how are these going to help us get to our goal?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you for that. Together, these are about 6.7% of the overall disposed waste stream, so about roughly a quarter of all packaging. And again, this is not the only products that would be addressed under a framework approach. These would just be prioritized potentially as first products to address. So it gets us part of the way there, but it certainly wouldn't be all the way there.
Okay, let's circle back over here, Fareed. Thank you. We'll come back down this way. Everybody, I really appreciate everybody is keeping comments pretty focused, and so we have plenty of time.
Hi, Roxanne Speakerman with Roplast, EVP and General Manager. I had a question, just stepping back from sort of the regulatory part of this. We've done a lot with regulation, and I see it propelling to kind of evolve and the waste reduction, the goals that are set forward. But just looking at the economics of it and looking at from a business perspective, as a manufacturer and a reprocessor, and looking at slide 10, and I know we've already briefly discussed this, but you guys talked about really bringing it back down to developing a state and county infrastructure to manage post-consumer packaging. Have you guys really thought into that in terms of on a micro level? In other words, we talked about incentivizing, but as a California manufacturer and reprocessor, we hold little advantage over out-of-state manufacturers and reprocessors. So is there any way that, has there been any consideration of incentivizing using California manufacturers that use recycled content, or incentivizing those reprocessors that are using California-sourced material, since, as you said, it is a volume-to-weight ratio, and considering the overall carbon footprint, keeping that material, especially plastic film, which I'm more specifically speaking to, is very important to keep it on a more regional basis. Has there been any thoughts on that on a micro level? I know it's still kind of in the conceptual phase.
There has been thinking, and there's been action on that, not related to this particular effort, but for example, we have the manufacturer's recycling tax rebate for investments in California infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure. We have the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund grants that have been appropriated to CalRecycle, and some of that has gone to composting and anaerobic digestion infrastructure, but also some of that has gone to the development of fiber or plastic or glass processing manufacturing in the state. Those are not large amounts at this point, but that is a step in that direction. So I think that that's been part of the discussion on the issue of siting infrastructure, not only the siting barriers, but financing barriers, and what's going to make those kinds of facilities pencil out. So.
And you mentioned at the beginning enforceable metrics and goals. With that in mind, have you had any thoughts of how something like this would be regulated on a post-consumer content level? As we've seen with other types of regulations, it becomes difficult with jurisdiction matters. But has there been any consideration of how that would be enforced, the minimal recycled content levels?
And for your question, so we have a few minimum recycled content programs, glass minimum and fiberglass, as well as some of our newsprint, our single-use plastic bags, reusable bags that have minimum content. So we are taking into consideration learning best management practices from those programs to apply for this one. And in terms of your question of how do we promote or support in-state manufacturers, I mean, that is something that we've learned from the glass minimum recycled content program, as well as what were the advantages and disadvantages of how that program was constructed.
I'll just add that Roxanne, discussions like you just brought up would be a really good example of the kind of discussion that would happen via the public process as part of the stage, so that rather than just have a across-the-board policy, and to sort of address Kevin's comment as well, this would allow a consistent framework to say, I know exactly when I'll have an opportunity to have those product-specific discussions that are relevant to maybe California manufacturers, maybe some other products they aren't as relevant, but that's the point. There would be an opportunity. So.
Got a couple hands in front here.
Hi, Laura Ferrante with Recology. Thank you so much for all of your work and efforts thus far. We are supportive of the framework approach and many of the policy tools that you've discussed here today. Due to the cost of processing materials and the investments that have already been made, we do also support processing and incentive payments. And we recommend that existing systems and infrastructure be utilized, and that the materials that we're discussing here stay within existing franchises.
Lauren.
Hi, Justin Lehrer with Stop Waste. I want to thank first the packaging team for crafting a thoughtful process and a really thoughtful, comprehensive document. I do think that the framework approach is the next logical step to helping manage the proliferation of different materials. I think, to your point, not a one-size-fits-all approach, but we need structure around it so that enable they give the ability to deal with different types of materials as technology advances, as innovation happens. We want to let innovation happen, but have a framework around it. And I also wanted to acknowledge was really happy to see the inclusion of tertiary packaging in this process, and the reusable packaging. It's mentioned in the source reduction policy tool. I think that the the transport packaging is the packaging that most consumers never see, but it's actually a really significant part of the waste stream. So I'm really glad to see that included as well.
Thank you. Emily over there. We'll take this comment, and then we're going to move on to some specific questions about each stage. I think they will stimulate some of the same kinds of comments that we've already gotten, but maybe others will speak. So,
thanks, Emily Topaldo again from the American Chemistry Council's Plastics Division. Has there been any consideration to including and I'm forgetting the proper name of it, but the market development group that's part of CalRecycle as part of this effort?
Recycling market development zones?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they would be, this particular effort does not identify a new funding source for incentives. But that issue has been brought up obviously by a number of people, that there needs to be incentives or funding of some sort for various programmatic aspects. Could be for infrastructure, could be for other purposes. The Recycling Market Development Zone and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that I mentioned, we do have monies available for loans and grants for infrastructure. The department is also, the legislature has, about 2 years ago, had a bill, Senate Bill 1063, which talked about the possibility of increasing the landfill tipping fee. And if so, some of those funds could be used for additional kinds of incentives, whether through those particular programs or otherwise. That was one idea that continues to be discussed. So there'd be a lot of ways to, we function, we probably meet with 150 or so businesses a year on different aspects of, assistance to them, whether it's to provide funding or siting or things like that. So that would be part and parcel of that overall approach, but not specific necessarily to this particular package. Clearly, the package talks about the need for funding. I mean, the package, this approach talks about the need for sustainable funding, and that would be part of that potential rulemaking, the application of policy tools. Okay, go ahead. We'll take that comment, but let's go ahead and bring up the next slide with questions. But go ahead, please.
Hi, Rachel O'Brien with Agricultural Council of California. When you guys were looking at your screening criteria, was product safety taken into consideration? How do you guys plan to account for the need to protect the goods while they're in transport, or once they get to the, as they're on their way through the supply chain to get to the consumer? Just wondering how that's going to be addressed.
I'll take a first stab looking over at the team here too. But so the paper didn't address package design to that level. So I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how to respond to your question. I don't think that anything.
I mean, a certain level of packaging is needed for consumer protection and food safety.
Absolutely.
And so as food producers and food processors, are trying to account for that, how is that being taken into consideration with this holistic package that you're developing? I mean, I think it needs to be considered. I think it should have been a criteria. It's not one that you've chosen, but I think as we go down this path, that has to be prevalent. That has to be in your minds, because without it, you're running into a whole other line of issues. So I want, if you haven't thought about it, I think it needs to be thought about, and we can get together and we can talk about that more. But if you do have thoughts, it'd be great to hear them.
Rachel, I think that I absolutely understand your comment that packaging absolutely has a purpose. Product protection is one, consumer protection. There's labeling requirements. There are requirements that are federal. There's a lot to it. I don't think anyone, certainly since the beginning of these discussions, we've indicated that we understand there's a need. I think that's one of the reasons why you see that we're not saying there needs to be any single policy approach for everything, because there's so many different kinds of considerations for the range of packaging, whether it's food content, food related or otherwise. So to say that there should be minimum content of X% for all packaging out there, that's not realistic. That isn't capable for for certain in certain applications. So I think that's a theme that I don't know if you've personally had a chance to participate throughout the almost 5 years of the process we've been through, or had a chance to look at some of the presentations or background materials we've presented. But that's absolutely not something that we're trying to do, is to say that that we're going to set targets and goals and metrics that will compromise product safety or public safety. So I think that the flexibility, when it would come time if something like this approach were to be enacted, the points of public process are what we'd absolutely be looking through to say, okay, for this particular packaging type, what makes sense? Which policy tool makes sense? Why not? What are the important considerations? And that we'd really be looking to the expertise of the stakeholders involved, not just the product manufacturers, but the folks that have to handle the material on the back end, and try to come up with something that makes the most sense for that product.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia, and thanks, Rachel, for your comment. I want to just reiterate what Cynthia said, but our task, our mission is to look at the downstream elements of the packaging material. And of course, we want to work with the manufacturers in terms of how does this fit in with your scheme. But again, our task here today is to make sure that we are reducing the amount that's going to landfill. So.
Okay. I thought in the beginning, Howard, or I think it was Howard mentioned that this, was looking at upstream and downstream. So I think that's why I wanted to raise that point, because that is a consideration for upstream if we're looking at this as a comprehensive policy approach.
Sure. My apologies. When I say downstream, I mean the upstream in terms of source reduction, incorporating minimum recycled content. Is this product, can it be reused?
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's, and this speaks a little bit to what Miriam brought up before, and what I responded earlier to Chuck, and that our primary driver is AB 341. Also now we have SB 1383, which Nick mentioned, getting materials out of landfills for various purposes. So we are looking at that in the sense that while we recognize the functions of packaging, and we have, over the years of this project, we've definitely publicly lauded and acknowledged individual company efforts to reduce packaging while still maintaining those essential functions, whatever that range might be. We still see a large amount of material ending up in landfills. It may have gone down a little bit. It's still 8 million tons. That's pretty significant. That was after the recession, so I think things have probably gone up. It's still a lot of material that we're dealing with. But we are looking at upstream in terms of, okay, how can we foster more source reduction that's going to reduce whatever is being produced without compromising those essential functions of packaging. And so I think that the paper tries to look at that from the perspective of when is it feasible to foster that approach? When does it not make sense? If we need to be more specific or explicit about needing to acknowledge safety concerns or some of the other things, I think that's something we can certainly talk about. So that's a perfect segue. These questions up here for stage one, you basically, we're addressing 2 or 3 of those right there in your comments. We've heard a lot of different ideas today about additional criteria, whether we can incorporate those into a final paper or they're more suggestive is something we'll have to take under consideration. Because remember, this is whatever we come up with as recommendations for our director, he may say yay or nay, but ultimately this would have to be translated into a legislative approach, and there you're going to have a lot of debate, obviously, about exactly what's going to be included and not included. So we want to make sure that we're not missing anything that's important. I don't know that we necessarily need to go through a reiteration of the screening process in order to make the same points, that we need to have some sort of screening criteria, some set of criteria, some process is the more important point here. But we have similar questions for the other stages, so I'll just kind of open it up, just trying to stimulate more discussion. Got a couple comments here.
Martin Bork, Ecology Center, again, just responding to that first question around policy tools. What's clear to us as collectors and processors and sellers of the packaging at the end of life is that there are real, we're in the midst of a major packaging revolution, and there have, over the last decade, been significant industry changes and trends, and that the producers of these new packaging types are really gearing up and investing significantly in expanding for the future. There are some real winners in that, and consumers, brand owners, packagers, food safety, all these things you just mentioned. There are also some real losers, and those are the folks who have to deal with it after the consumer is done with it. And those are the people way upstream who are dealing with it, wellhead communities, pipeline communities, fence line communities, transit communities, who are really experiencing the impacts, as we have also seen in Houston recently with the petrochemical disaster that's resulting from the flooding and hurricane. So in terms of policy tools that begin to address the inequity in packaging and look at how do we make the winners who are currently receiving, I would say, windfall benefits from this new packaging model, how do we translate that into mitigating some of the impacts of packaging. And somebody asked a question about the problems, and we could go into those in more depth. But I'm thinking about a pay-as-you-produce model that goes all the way up the stream to the manufacturers, and a mill tax or something like that that produces a fund that we can use on the downstream side for infrastructure, processing, handling, cleanup, et cetera, maybe mitigations and along the way, market stabilization. So, we've talked about EPR. That's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I'm just thinking about a fee per unit on packaging and looking at the different kinds of impacts it might have.
Thank you, Mark. Susan? Susan, identify yourself first.
Yeah, I'm Susan Collins from Container Recycling Institute, addressing the first question on policy tools that were included. And I have not read the 49-page document, so I apologize if it's already listed there, but I didn't see one of the strategies listed as just incorporating more materials into the state's existing bottle bill on the list of policy options. And it occurs to me that 2 of the 6 priority products, pouches and aseptics, are things that could be incorporated into the state's existing bottle bill program with the state's existing infrastructure for that. And those items are covered in some other bottle bills in the world, the closest one being British Columbia, covers both of those material types. Also, just strengthening the existing bottle bill to cover everything that is logical and feasible to cover. It's been years since I calculated the tonnage on this, but when I did, it was 1% of the state's disposed waste stream. And if the context is that the goal is 25% of packaging, which adds up to 6.7%, just improving and strengthening and making more complete the existing bottle bill would get you one of those 6.7 points. So it's very significant in the context of today's discussion. Also, as an example of just what has happened in the last couple of years, we requested data from CalRecycle on the changes in glass tonnage over the last 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. And glass tonnage to the redemption centers in the bottle bill has declined by 129,000 tons. And that was as a result of some of the policy changes that went through and the loss of redemption centers. So again, just strengthening the program that we already have can get us one step down the road toward achieving these policy objectives. And lastly, just to add to the context, the big background that we're all dealing with, I want to also add the information that a couple of years ago, the forest products producers, paper and paper packaging producers, implemented an agricultural checkoff program, which gives them funding of $20 to $25 million a year that they are using to advertise the benefits of paper packaging. So if you look at California's population percentage being about 10%, that means there's going to be roughly $2 million a year worth of advertising to promote the benefits of paper products and paper packaging in this state. I actually saw one of the ads on Meet the Press the other day. And my point there is that as you are implementing or thinking about considering these policy goals that will help reduce, and especially in the context of source reduction, there's this other force out there that at least wants to take market share away from other packaging types, but to grow the market share of their package type, and that those two forces are probably at odds with each other, and you should be aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks. Did you want to comment, Karen?
Thank you for your comment, Susan. I just want to mention that we mentioned deposit systems broadly, but not the bottle bill.
Karen, can you speak more directly?
Sorry,
into
we
the mic?
mentioned deposit systems broadly, but not the bottle bill specifically. So thank you.
While we're moving to the next commenters, let's flip the next slide up. We can go anywhere on these discussions because we have been everywhere. Go ahead, Miriam.
Again, I'm Miriam Gordon with Upstream Policy. In terms of policies that are missing, I alluded to this earlier. I think that because source reduction is the highest priority in the integrated waste management hierarchy, that I'm wondering why reusables and refillables haven't been addressed in the policy approaches. I note that in Oregon, there's a new refillables program emerging, and so I'd like to see at least some exploration of that concept. I have a question. I think that in addition to in terms of motivating consumers to use less disposable packaging, I'm wondering if, I don't know if the materials management fee policy that's suggested in the document encompasses the idea of fees, consumer fees attached to single-use disposables. That's another policy option that we've already employed in California with the paper bag fee. And so I'm just wondering if that's something that is already anticipated in this or whether you've thought about it.
Thanks, Miriam. I think that to address your last comment about have we considered suggesting attaching fees to single-use packaging items, I don't think that the paper that we called anything out that specific. So we'll take that, I think, into consideration. Karen, in Karen's presentation, she mentioned how the challenge that we had with using reusables and recyclability as criterion for the screening process. But I believe we have called out the need for source reduction as to be considered throughout this process, but I don't know. I mean, I think that we can do that a little bit more explicitly in the final model. So would be looking forward to talking with you more if you have specific ideas about that.
Got you, Chuck. Coming around.
Tony Kingsbury again. For all of these proposed questions that we're asking and the policies that we're looking at, I think we need to think about this in the context of, I work a lot in the chemical space, and we always talk about alternatives assessment. You know, when you move from one chemical to another, you know, you can move away from something you dislike, but if you don't understand what you're going to, you can end up with unintended consequences. And I think we run the risk of doing the same thing here, and that for each of these policy considerations, we need to understand the unintended consequences, or potential. Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it seems like it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, you know, what these some of these policy considerations will do in the marketplace. And so play through those scenarios, you know, to the lady's comment earlier from the agricultural end, you know, are we going to affect food waste, right, in a positive or negative way? You know, clearly one of the priorities of CalRecycle is dealing with food waste. Let's not create more of it so you have more of it to deal with, kind of things. So just something to add for all of the policy considerations is that alternative assessment / unintended consequence consideration.
Thank you for the comment. That's certainly something that we are keeping in mind. That's part of the motivation behind a comprehensive approach, is to at least avoid moving to alternatives that would be much more likely under a piecemeal approach. But certainly there are quite a number of impacts that any kind of model is going to have. So appreciate that.
And as we move forward, when we close today, we're going to indicate that we were still seeking written comments, and Karen already said that, and also the ability to meet with folks. But those would be some of the things that as you read through the paper, one of the things that we have done is at least to start looking at the pros and cons of these different policy tools, acknowledging that there's going to be impacts. If you choose this tool, it's going to have some trade-offs. We want to make sure that we're capturing all those issues or those potential impacts. Chuck.
Yeah, again, Chuck White with Manette LLP. Just to reiterate a comment I made earlier about the stage 2, are there other tools? And I would really strongly suggest that one of the tools you look at is working with California Air Resources Board to find ways to maximize the production of low carbon fuels from packaging waste that would enable and facilitate the collection and processing and recycling, if you will, of packaging waste into low carbon fuels. I think it'd be a tremendous outlet for these materials, and it would fulfill another extremely important policy need of the state of California, is to produce low carbon fuels. And there's a variety of technologies that can be applied, and I would think that you'd want to evaluate the pluses and minuses of all those technologies to hopefully maximize the production of low carbon fuels. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck, and I'll acknowledge your subtle and nice restatement of the issue. Other comments? We'll flash the other slides. There's 2 more slides, but we're really open to any comments right now. You want to put up? Obviously, we were expecting that folks would be on the soapbox a little more, and that we would then have to hone it down. But we started off pretty quickly getting into specific issues or specific comments, which I appreciate. So we'll just keep it open, or we can close early. Why don't we, we won't close it, and we'll give you a little time to think, but why don't we go to the next steps slide and just indicate again what those are while people are considering whether they want to provide any additional comments today? So, we'll get Veronica. We do want to take written comments if you're willing to provide them. We'd like to have them by October 31st. Our goal in this is to have a set of recommendations that will be made public after the turn of the year. It would be at a public monthly meeting, some draft recommendations for our director to consider. So whether that's January or February, we kind of have to see how things roll out, but we want to do this early in the year. So we need to have written comments back relatively soon so we can really consider them. They can be reiterating what we've heard today. They've been taking copious notes. So we'll be looking at some of these comments and how to revise the paper and hone it down. We also, as Karen said, are willing to meet with folks on one-on-one on discussions over the next month or so. We then get into the holidays, and just having the time to revise this in a thoughtful way and get it out in public for one of those meetings is sort of the constraint that we're operating under. I forget who had, Veronica.
Veronica Pardo, California Refuse Recycling Council. We talked a little bit about National Sword, and I just wanted to bring that issue up again with the 3 through 7s and the mixed paper and some of the diversion issues we're going to face within the infrastructure that we already currently use and the collection methods that we use. So in some of your criteria for, is there an infrastructure for this material, may or may not answer the question of whether or not we have markets and the ability to move that material in the next years or decades or whatnot. So I think that conversation is really relevant here in terms of the larger packaging conversation, and just it's a time issue, right? We're facing export issues, and this is something that we need to work on in terms of California markets and keeping that material here and managing it here. So just wanted to elevate that issue again.
Can I just really quickly, Veronica, thanks for bringing that up again. And I think one of the that's not going to be an easy thing to deal with. And I think that Howard mentioned that the department is going to be conducting some workshops soon to elevate that discussion as well. I think one of the things that this the stages in the process that the framework outlines really can facilitate a discussion about phasing and timing of particular policy tools. So maybe for a particular group of packaging, a packaging category or specific kinds, maybe there are certain policies that maybe are more minor but can be helpful to put in place sooner, and then identify some that can occur, further down the line, but that will ultimately need to be put in place to facilitate those I don't want to say broader, more significant policy tools. So just the idea of tackling a complex issue, that the phasing approach is something that really can be utilized with this approach as well. And I think that's what it'll take for the national sword discussion.
Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, just one final thought.
Kevin, just identify yourself again for the
okay, it's Kevin Messner
audience.
with the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. If you're going to go through with a draft recommendation on a broad framework, I guess I'd encourage you to narrow it or specify as much as you can. It's very difficult for us to provide comments when things are so broad, and going to these are large appliance manufacturers and say, hey, this is packaging. And we ran into that with safer consumer chemicals. There were broad definitions like you have on film plastics that go everywhere from a shrink wrap to a distribution center or a plant floor to something in a retail store. And those are very different questions, and getting that kind of specificity to you when you have such broadly defined terms and angles is very difficult. So I encourage you to narrow or specify the scope as much as you can. And I also, as I said before, I think the more you narrow it, the easier and less complicated it'll be as well. And it'll be easier for us to get more substantive comments as opposed to the large comments that we've gotten so far. So more specificity, the better, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Another hand over here. A couple.
It was mentioned earlier about...
repeat your name, please.
Sorry, this is Roxanne Speakerman. I'm the General Manager and EVP of Roplast Industries. It was mentioned earlier that there should be some type of fee associated with producers. And I don't disagree with that. Even as a producer, I think that as long as it works somewhat like, say, the green dot system or something where we're able to get channeled material back to us. But really, it's in the hands of the brand owners. I mean, as a manufacturer, I will sit down with a brand owner all day long and tell them why they need to produce something, or they need to engineer their or compromise their marketing to produce something. But these brand managers need to have the pressure on them. We want to change. I think several California manufacturers want to. What pressure is going to be put on the brands to incorporate these changes, because really they hold the power in a lot of this.
Points well taken, and I would ask Cynthia maybe if she wants to make any comments on that. But in our EPR programs, carpet, paint, and mattress, we do recognize that their brand owners are a key part of that whole approach.
Well, and I'll add in that we have been meeting with brand owners and have been setting up meetings with brand owners to help try to get at this. And we recognize that there are roles for everyone within the product chain, and that it's not just on the manufacturers and it's not just on consumers, that there are many, many folks who are involved in this. And so appreciate the comments, and that is something that we are looking at.
I think we had another hand. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, Andy Hackman for Ameripen. One of the tools that you have up there, I guess, impacts the consumer with pay-as-you-throw.
Can you just hold the mic up a little closer?
Is that better? One of the tools that you have up there impacts the consumer in terms of pay-as-you-throw, but you don't discuss consumer behavior as it exists now in the system and how that might potentially be changed. So I don't know if that's a screening criteria that could be anticipated, but there's not, from my initial read, much discussion about how consumer behavior is going to change in this framework.
Could you be a little, or maybe we can do some follow-ups with you, kind of how you might be thinking about that and how it could be incorporated into a framework. So. Other comments? Won't be your last chance. But I'm not seeing, we've heard a lot today. I think the general turn of the comments has been really helpful. It's been very suggestive. It's been critical in spots, which I also take positively. That's fine. So we appreciate the comments that we've gotten today. We encourage you to send them in to us via writing. Again, and there's several follow-ups that I think we've indicated, but if others of you who are interested in having some one-on-one discussions, we're happy to set those up over the next 2 months, well, a month and a half or so. And then we will be presenting something again. We won't have another workshop prior to the end of this calendar year. I think what our intent is, and this could change, but our intent is to bring an actual recommendation to our director at one of our public meetings, which is generally the third Tuesday of the month, probably January-ish, February, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate the thoughtful comments and your attention to this. It's been an issue that's been going on for a long time. It's going to continue to go on. It's not an easy one at all, as we all recognize. So thanks very much.
And a couple of quick housekeeping things. First is that we would ask that you use the new packaging email account now that we're expanding beyond just Cynthia being lead on this. We appreciate you using the shared email account. This is actively monitored. You will get a response, even though it's not to an individual person, but that helps us keep track of comments as well as meeting requests. We also have a packaging listserv that we would encourage for you to sign up. I know a lot of you have, but wanted to put that back out there. And then again, if you hadn't had a chance to sign in on your way in, we'd appreciate it if you could sign in or drop your card in the basket so that we can make sure that we're following up. So again, thank you all for your attention and comments, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks.